It's live stream back to this. No, you have to know we're here. No, I haven't met her yet. Yes, yes. So we have a group of Filipinos online. Pastor from Canada, Filipino.
Not taking your seat, right?
No, and Sophia and two more.
Welcome everybody. Welcome to those of you who have come back. Welcome to any who are here for the first time tonight. We're delighted to have you. Welcome to those who are live streaming this event. Welcome to the Modbury viewers on Sunday night. And welcome to anybody who should be seeing this when it's recorded as a podcast. And Mario, we are privileged to have you again, and I'll introduce you a little bit more in a moment. Earlier today, the preschoolers at the Fullerton Park Community Centre shared a greeting, an accounting song inspired by the Uluru Statement from the Heart. It was quite inspiring. As was their attention as First Nations people read out the statement from the heart on a video clip. So as we acknowledge tonight that we meet here on the land of the Kaurna peoples, we recall that countless generations of children had passed on to them a culture infused with the awareness that human beings are in a, let's call it a covenant with the land, that life was given meaning through story, ceremony and songs. We here tonight acknowledge that we're privileged to be invited to walk with them in anticipation of the day when due recognition will be made by the Australian nation, when who they are and their voice is enshrined in the Australian Constitution. Just a couple of housekeeping comments. The toilets are in the front of the church, the men's and the women's. COVID rules are now being relaxed, but we still encourage people to keep a socially distant to make you feel comfortable. And of course, while we don't have to wear masks, if you wish to wear masks, of course, please do. Our plan for the evening is that, first of all, Mario will introduce and speak to his topic. And during the presentation, there'll be an opportunity to consider questions for discussion. It may be that we're asked to sit and think first. I wrote the word sink instead of think. Can you imagine that? And then we'll move into groups of two or four, whatever is comfortable for discussion. And by the way, when responding, if you respond at all, you'll need to have the, where is it? It's down there, I think, the microphone. Because this is live streamed, we have to make sure that everything goes through the sound system. And of course, given time restraints, there may also be room for questions at the end. Mario Trinidad. I'm abbreviating your bio here, Mario. Is a retired practitioner and lecturer in social work. He's also a theologian with a particular interest in liberation theology, and he knows at first hand the praxis it leads to and its empowering influence to radicalise, for example, Catholic missionaries in Guatemala. He's still active, volunteering with St Paul, St Vinny's, St Paul, the St Vincent de Paul Society, still supporting Latin American refugees and asylum seekers, and keeping some of us up to date about the Philippines. Küng, the renowned Swiss Catholic theologian who greatly influenced the Second Vatican Council, is the name that comes up in bold print tonight. And we'll hear how he, later in life, imagined a global, I think we'd call it a robust global ethic, which I believe has the capacity to counter those on the international as well as the local scene who act with seeming impunity. Mario, over to you.
Good evening, and thank you, Jonathan. I also acknowledge that we meet on traditional Gano land and pay my respects to elders past, present, and emerging, and I also support the Uluru Statement of the Heart. It's a pleasure to be here with you tonight, and I hope it will be a pleasure for you too eventually. Let me start with a disclaimer. Though I was first introduced to the works of Hans Küng during my undergraduate theological studies in the Philippines in the early 70s, yes, that's how old I am, I make no claims to be an expert on his theology. My later theological pursuits, as some of you know, and as Jonathan mentioned, led me instead to liberation theologies. I am grateful to Jonathan for asking me to talk about tonight's topic because it has given me the opportunity to refamiliarize myself with Küng and do some research on the development of the project of global responsibility, which was close to him to his heart until the end of his life. Tonight I'll try to cover briefly these 5 points, starting with the introduction and a brief biography of Hans Küng and his theological path. Then some words about the global ethic and global responsibility, and his point that religions as a possible foundation for a global ethic. Then I'll end with the declaration of a global ethic in the 1993 Parliament of World Religions, and with the conclusion. Küng's obituary in the New York Times, published on the day of his death on April 6, 2021, last year, said, Dr. Küng stood at the center of Christianity's great upheavals in the latter half of the 20th century. His relentless challenges to the church hierarchy caused his critics to call him the greatest threat to the church since Martin Luther, even the Antichrist. What a recommendation. As a liberal, he criticized church policy on governance, liturgy, papal infallibility, birth control, priestly celibacy, the ordination of women, mixed marriages, homosexuality, abortion, the meaning of hell, and much else. Küng was born in Sorcy, Switzerland on the 19th of March, 1928. He studied philosophy and theology at the Pontifical Gregorian University in Rome and was ordained in 1954. He continued his education in various European institutions, including the Sorbonne and the Institut Catholique de Paris, where he obtained a doctorate in theology with a dissertation in 1957 on Karl Barth's doctrine of justification. In his dissertation, he identified a number of areas of agreement between Barthian and Catholic theologies of justification, concluding that the differences were not fundamental and did not warrant a division in the church. The book included a letter from Karl Barth, attesting that he agreed with Küng's representation of his theology. Barth, however, did not agree with Küng's conclusion that the Reformation was an overreaction. In his book, Küng argued that Barth, like Martin Luther, overreacted against the Catholic Church, which, despite its imperfection, has been and remains the body of Christ. At the invitation of Karl Barth, Küng delivered a lecture on the prospects of reform of the Catholic Church. Then he was very optimistic. Just a week before Pope John the 23rd announced his plans for a council in January 1959. In 1960, he was appointed professor of systematic theology at the University of Tübingen in Germany. In 1962, he was appointed Peritus, expert, by Pope John the 23rd, serving at 34 years old as the youngest expert theological advisor to participants in the Second Vatican Council until its conclusion in 1965. Throughout his life, in all 24 volumes of his collected works, Küng developed a genuinely global agenda, not only for the church, but also for the world. In his book, What I Believe, published in 2010, he expounds on what drives him to write. He says, I am writing for people who are searching, who cannot cope with the faith of either Roman Catholic or Protestant traditionalists, but are not content with their unbelief or doubts about faith. I am writing for those who don't want cheap wellness spirituality or short-term help in life. I am also writing for all those who live out their faith but would like to be able to give an account of it, who not only simply believe, but also want to know, and therefore expect a view of faith which is grounded in philosophy, theology, exegesis, and history, and has practical consequences. His theological career can be divided into three periods. Those are the three periods there. with some inevitable overlapping. The first or early period from the 1950s to the 1970s deals with Küng, the ecclesiologist and ecumenist. He concentrated on intra-ecclesial issues, justification, reform and reunion, the nature of the church, and infallibility. It was during this period that Küng was one of the experts of the Second Vatican Council. For those who are interested, Christopher Ruddy, Associate Professor of Historical and Systematic Theology at the Catholic University of America, has written a comparison of the two different paths of church reform that Küng and the French theologian Yves Congar, another expert during the Second Vatican Council, had taken. According to Ruddy, Congar chose the inside path of active patience and a certain incrementalism. He agreed to work in the system so as to reform it from within. Küng, for his part, took the path of the outsider in order to avoid being compromised, as he saw it, by collaboration with the Roman curial system. Küng's model reformer is St. Paul, whom he depicts as freely confronting Peter at the Council of Jerusalem. The true reformer, according to Küng, has a fourfold imperative: to suffer, to pray, to criticize, and to act. Therefore, the reformer must criticize when necessary. Criticism can in fact be a duty of a Christian, he says. Loyalty and prudence do not mean that everything must be approved or excused. It was Küng's questions around papal infallibility in his book, Infallible, an Inquiry, that led to Rome's withdrawal in December 1979 of his Missio Canonica, that is the formal approval of him as a Catholic theologian. This meant he could no longer teach in the Catholic faculty at the University of Tübingen and be recognized as a Catholic theologian. In response, the university removed the Institute for Ecumenical Research, which Küng had founded and had headed since the 1960s, along with his professorship outside of that faculty's jurisdiction. Küng continued to teach as a tenured professor of ecumenical theology until his retirement in 1969. As a result, in this second period of his theological career in the 1980s, Küng turned his attention to broader issues, namely a dialogue with world religions. There's an anecdote, and I don't know whether true or apocryphal, that says Küng, one of the bishops, wanted to propose Küng as cardinal of the church, just as Avery Dulles, and Yves Congar, theologians who became cardinals at the end of their career. And in such a position, he could be pope. But he refused, he says, to be pope because then he would cease being infallible. The third period, which is our concern for tonight, began in the 1990s and focuses on universal questions such as global ethics, the future of the world, and the role of religion for humanity. It is during this period that the project of global responsibility, wealth ethos, in German, was first undertaken. Küng devoted the last 30 years of his life to the development of his project of global responsibility. And he skillfully set up its lasting institutional presence in the University of Tübingen. He organized symposia and workshops with representatives from many academic and cultural disciplines and fields in order to explore global possibilities for cooperation between religions and other human agencies. During this period, his book on these topics include Global Responsibility in Search for a New World Ethic, published in 1990, and A Global Ethic for Global Politics and Economics, published in 1997, aside from articles and speeches. In tonight's presentation, I will draw primarily from the first book and related articles. Küng begins a 1990 article entitled Towards a World Ethic of World Religions, Fundamental Questions of Present-Day Ethics in the Global Context, with these questions. What you have here in the slides are excerpts, so I will read the longer version of the questions. Why should a human being do good and not evil? Why should human beings not deceive, cheat, and rob their fellow human beings if this is to their advantage, and they have no fear of discovery and punishment in a particular case? Why should a politician resist corruption if he can be sure of the discretion of his financial backers? Why should a businessman limit his concern for profit if greed and the get rich slogan are publicly preached without any moral scruples? Why should the embryo researcher not develop a commercial reproductive technique which manufactures guaranteed perfect embryos and cast the rejects into the rubbish bin? But the question is not only directed at the individual. Why should a people, a race, a religion, if they have at their disposal the necessary instruments of power, not hate and bully? And if that is their concern, even exile and liquidate a minority that is different and believes something different, an alien minority. Or one might ask, he says, in respect of good, why should human beings be always friendly, gentle, or even helpful to other human beings? Why should a young person in particular renounce the use of force and opt in principle for nonviolence? Why should the entrepreneur or the banker, even if no one is supervising, behave with unconditional correctness? Why should a trained union official, even if it were to damage his career, not only fight for his own organization, but also for the general good? Why, for the scientist and for a doctor working on transplantation, should a human being in experiment and therapy never be the object of commercialization and industrialization? But the question must also be put in general terms. Why should one people, or one race, or one religion show tolerance, respect, or even reverence towards another? Why should those who wield power among the nations and religions commit themselves in every case to peace and never to war? So once again, the fundamental question: why should human beings, understood as individuals, groups, nations, religions, Why should they behave in a humane way, a truly humane way, that is with humanity? And why should they do this unconditionally, that is in every case? That is the basic question in every system of ethics. That is to say, in every philosophical or doctrinal or theological doctrine of values and norms which should guide our decisions. Before we hear how Küng answers this, let us hear from each other. I encourage you to speak with each other, to talk with each other, and say, why? Why should human beings behave in a human way, a truly humane way? Please. Thank you.
You know, when you walk over here, it doesn't work so well.
All right.
This is the microphone for the live stream.
Okay. So I'll just, yeah. Thank you for that.
I'm sure it's fine. Otherwise, we could put the radio on.
No. Thank you for that.
Going beautifully.
Thank you. Can we come back to the bigger group? Any comments from the floor? No, I didn't want to silence you.
I'll ask one question. Good and evil. What's the origin of evil? That's my question to you.
Oh, my question to me. Okay. The origin of evil. That's a whole book, Norm. That's a whole book. The mystery of evil.
You've got to know what good and evil are if you're going to distinguish between the two of them.
Well, I think if my reading of him is correct, it has to do with being human. What is evil is what destroys humanity. And then, of course, we can argue as to what constitutes humanity and what doesn't constitute humanity. But that could be the framework. The framework is and in that instance then, which we'll talk about, it's not just what destroys humanity, but this was 30 years ago, more than 30 years ago. He was also already saying what destroys the environment, what destroys our world. So can we leave it at that for the meantime? Before I finish my dissertation on that? Yeah.
I wanted to segue from the environment. I like the idea that brotherly love is the only magic that is available to human beings to cope with nature. And so it's something that they invest in the hope to be able to handle misfortune.
Thank you.
And you've given me a segue into my thought, because it's something to do with the next generation, and you've used the word investing in, and you look at what's happening in Ukraine, where people are willing to sacrifice, but invest in it for their future, for their children.
You just reminded me, Marion, and this is for the sake of my... the Uniting Church of South Australia had a very strong solidarity history with the Philippines. And on Monday is the elections in the Philippines. And the candidate preferred by the churches, both Catholic and non-Catholic Protestant churches, have come out openly for Leni Robredo. And Leni says very clearly, the elections are not about politicians. The elections are about the future. So vote for the future, not for the person, the politician. Right? So anyway, thank you for that. Yes. All right. Today, these questions are asked within societies where there is a clear crisis of orientation, according to Küng, where countries distrust each other. We just heard Marion mention Ukraine, where within countries there is division among peoples. Küng points out that science, with no wisdom to prevent the misuse of scientific research, technology, with no spiritual energy to bring the unforeseen risks of a highly efficient major technology under control, industry, with no ecology to combat the ever-expanding economy, and democracy, with no morality with which to counteract the huge power interests of the various men of power and power groups, do not offer satisfactory responses and effective action plans. Modern science and technological thinking have proved themselves from the outset as incapable of justifying universal values, human rights, and ethical standards. I draw on a more recent example to illustrate this. While we have the scientific know-how to combat the coronavirus in a relatively short time, which shows how fast science can find solutions, we do not have the values to make it universally available. In countries like my native Philippines, coronavirus cases are undercounted underreported because a PCR test costs as much as 200 Australian dollars. Many die of unreported cases of coronavirus fatalities. Thus, not all scientific advances are advances for humanity. Indeed, Küng writes, the evil brought about by science and technology cannot simply be cured by even more science and more technology. Even reason and philosophy face difficulties in providing, quote, a foundation for practicable ethics, unquote. Where should it get its criteria from in order to judge the interests that lie behind all knowledge? How should pure reason decide between true and illusory, objective and subjective, acceptable and reprehensible interests? How should it establish purely rational priorities and indeed limits? Küng indicts philosophy for not going beyond what he calls problematic generalizations and utilitarian pragmatic models, which are generally too abstract for the average person and can in no way be generally binding. Faced with the inability of reason to guide people out of what Küng calls the danger of spiritual homelessness and moral waywardness, many, he writes, have resorted to horoscopes to provide the basic orientation for important decisions. So how do we get out of these uncertainties and maze where neither science and technology nor reason and philosophy could lead us out? Küng pleads for the primacy of ethics over politics and economics. Firstly, he asserts the primacy of politics over the economy. I hope our politicians are listening. That is, the economy must not function solely in the allegedly rational and strategic self-assertion of the economic man, but must rather serve higher ethical and political ends. Economic progress as an end in itself has led to inequalities and inhuman consequences. Not only has it led to social destabilization, divisions, and the growing gap between the rich and the poor in the world and within countries. We also see in the blind pursuit of economic progress the destruction of the environment, the destruction of our forests, climate change, waste dumping, and so on and so forth. Secondly, Küng asserts the primacy of ethics over the economy and politics. They are subject to the ethical criteria of humanness. Fundamental though economics and politics are, they are subject to the ethical criteria of humaneness. Neither the economy nor politics has the primacy, but rather the unassailable dignity of human beings. Their rights and responsibilities are to be preserved in everything. In place of an ethic of success, Küng calls for an ethic of responsibility. Indeed, a global ethic of responsibility, a responsibility for our neighbors, the environment, and the world after us. Our slogan, he proposes, should be, world society is responsible for its own future. he poses the question, what basic principles should be leading forces in politics, economics, science, and the religions, and proposes the answer. The answer is that human beings must become more than they are. They must become more human. What is good for human beings is what preserves and furthers the humanity and makes it succeed. Human beings must exhaust their human potential in an unprecedented way to produce the most humane society possible and in an intact environment. The basic ethical principle must be that human beings may never be made mere means. They must remain an ultimate and always be a goal and criterion in themselves. Human beings must always remain the subject and never become the object. In raising the question about the foundation of the unconditional validity of particular basic ethical values and attitudes, in Küng's view, only religion, expressed inter alia by the three prophetic religions of Christianity, Judaism, and Islam, the mystical religions of Indian origin, Hinduism and Buddhism, and Chinese Confucianism and Taoism, can provide this foundation. True religion, I think I've put it there. True religion, true humanity, is indeed a prerequisite for true religion, he says. Religion which in themselves do not make human rights a reality, are no longer credible today. The converse has also become clear. True religion is the fulfillment of true humanity. It is the prerequisite for the realization of true humanity. If there is to be humanity, he says, among men and women as an unconditional and universal obligation, there must be religion, he says. Before we explore Küng's view of religions as a possible foundation for global ethic, two provisos are in order. First, he says, I firmly maintain that the human being without religion can also lead a life that is genuinely humane. That is to say, with humanity, and in this sense, moral. This is precisely the expression of a person's inner autonomy. But one thing those without religion cannot do, he says, even if they were to accept unconditional norms for themselves, is to justify the unconditionality and universality of ethical obligation. It remains uncertain why I should follow such norms unconditionally in every case and in every place, even when they run contrary to my interests. For what is an ethic worth in the last analysis if it is not valid without all ifs and buts, he says, unconditional. But the unconditionality of the obligations cannot come, he says, from pure reason alone. That might be questioned. And then his second comment is, a global ethic is no substitute for the Torah, the Gospels, the Qur'an, the Bhagavadgita, the discourses of the Buddha, or the teachings of Confucius and others. A global ethic can only create the necessary minimum of common values, standards, and basic attitudes. A global ethic is defined as a minimal basic consensus relating to binding values, irrevocable standards, and moral attitudes which can be affirmed by all religions despite their dogmatic differences and can also be supported by non-believers. Küng claims that in all religious, philosophical, and ideological traditions, there are some simply ethical imperatives of humanity which have remained of utmost importance. He identifies two most elementary ethical principles found in all great religions and ethical traditions of the world. The first is the principle of humanity. In the face of all inhumanity, our religious and ethical convictions demand that every human being must be treated humanly. This means that every human being, and these are his words, man or woman, white or colored, young or old, American or Iraqi, Israeli or Palestinian, has to be treated not in an inhuman way, even bestial way, but in a truly human way. The second fundamental demand that he has recognized and he has written about, he says, is the golden rule. The principle which is found and persisted and has persisted in many religious and ethic traditions of humankind for thousands of years. What do you not wish done to yourself, do not do to others. So there's a slide there of what the versions of the golden rule from the different religions. Küng's argument that religion is a possible foundation for the global ethic stems from his view that the categorical and unconditional nature of the ethical demand, the unconditional nature of the thou shalt, cannot find its justification in a human being who is conditioned in so many ways, but only in the unconditional. An absolute which can provide an overall meaning which embraces and pervades the human individual, even human nature, indeed the whole human community. That can only be the final highest reality which, while it cannot be rationally proved, can be accepted in trust based on reason. Whatever this reality is called, and however it is understood and interpreted in all religions. However, the unconditionality nature of ethics is grounded in different religions, whether they derive their demands more directly from the mysterious absolute or a figure of revelation, from an old tradition or a sacred book. One thing is sure, he says, religions can express their ethical demands with a completely different authority from a merely human one. He recognizes the disagreements between religions. So manifest, he says, that only someone who sees ghosts needs to fear the rise of one universal religion. Though he believes in the possible unity between the Christian churches, lifting all in the instances of mutual excommunication in favor of basic communion, which would represent a unity in diversity, he does not believe in a unity of world religions representing necessary different paths. Such a unity of world religions, he points out, is not even necessary as long as all religions are accepted in themselves as legitimate paths to salvation. The various religions differ from one another in their teachings and writings, in their rites and institutions, and in their ethics and discipline. It is important, however, that despite all the differences, we try to discern agreements, or at least convergence. Because, and this is one of his mantras, without peace between religions, there will be no peace between nations. He says it is a task of scholars of various religions to work out, based on the sources that they have in common, what are these convergences and agreements. At the present stage of investigation, he says, he's able to identify absolute agreement in 4 basic ethical imperatives. Thou shalt not kill, thou shalt not lie or break promises, thou shalt not commit adultery or fornication, thou shalt do good. This agreement can easily be demonstrated, he claims, not only in the prophetic religions of the Near Eastern Semitic origin, but also in the mystical religions of Indian origin, aiming at unity with the absolute, and in the religions of Chinese origin, steeped in wisdom and concerned with ethical imperatives. What do we think? What do you think? Time to talk to each other. What do we think?
I'm a bit surprised with the first one, thou shalt not kill the innocent. What about the rest of it?
I think, remember, this is what the convergences and agreements. That's why, because there will be some religions where whatever innocent, non-innocent would be considered would be killed. So there is an agreement that the innocent cannot be killed. Or any questions? Or would you like to have a conversation among yourselves just for a couple of minutes?
What I'm doing now, I'm telling you, writing a message to the lives of others, inviting them to ask a question. If they have a question, I'll read their question.
Can we come back to the big group? Any comment?
We thought they seemed to us the Ten Commandments, that they are all the rules and things. Oh, that's real.
Sounds like the Ten Commandments. Thou shalt not do this. Thou shalt not do that. Why not, we suggested as a group, why not we begin, let us be humane by doing this. Let us be humane by doing that. And so there is a series of 10 humane incentives.
Now we cannot change his thinking anymore because he's dead, right? But Fergus and I had a brief discussion because the thou shalt sounds like an obligation, right? And possibly that's how, remember two things I would say. One is my reading of Küng is very clear. The obligation doesn't come from outside. It's not an outside. The absolute, however we conceive of it, however the religions conceive of it, is not an outside, but it's coming from within. That's one. Secondly, he was trying to look for convergences and agreements, he says, between all those religions. And some would say it like that very clearly, thou shalt, like the Ten Commandments, for example, right? So what we've done so far, very briefly, is look at his life and look at his view of the global ethic, the global responsibility. And he claims that the ethic to be responsible for each other and for the world cannot come from human reason alone. And he talks of religion as the source of the ethic. And with this I will end. We actually, you'll be familiar with the Parliament of World Religions that met here in Melbourne in 2009. In 1993, which was the centenary of the first Parliament of World Religions, was held in Chicago. Were you there at the time?
No, not at that time.
Yeah.
Later.
And the text that came out of it, the Declaration towards a Global Ethic, was drafted by Hans Küng, right? So Hans Küng summarizes his vision in 3 phases. There will be no survival of our globe without a global ethic. There will be no peace among nations without peace among the religions. And there will be no peace among the religions without dialogue and cooperation among the religions and civilizations. Since the 1993 World Parliament of Religions. There have been 6 others. And as I said, in 2009 it was in Melbourne. And next year, the 8th, is in Chicago again. The declaration starts with, and I have excerpts there, the world is in agony. Remember, this was written in 1993. The agony is so pervasive and urgent that we are compelled to name its manifestation so that the depth of this pain may be made clear. Peace eludes us, continues to elude us. The planet is being destroyed. We continue to destroy the planet. Neighbors live in fear. Women and men are estranged from each other. Children die. This is abhorrent, they say. We condemn the abuses of Earth's ecosystems. We condemn the poverty that stifles life's potential, the hunger that weakens the human body, the economic disparities that threaten so many families with ruin. We condemn the social disarray of nations, the disregard for justice that pushes citizens to the margin, the anarchy overtaking our communities, and the insane death of children from violence. In particular, the delegates then said, we condemn aggression and hatred in the name of religion. But this agony need not be, they say. The declaration then affirms that a common set of core values is found in the teachings of religions, and that these form the basis of a global ethic. We confirm, they said, that there is already a consensus among religions that can be a basis of a global ethic, a minimal, fundamental consensus concerning binding values, irrevocable standards, and fundamental moral attitudes. In conclusion, there will be no peace among nations without peace among the religions, no peace among the religions without dialogue between the religions, no dialogue between the religions without common ethical standards, and no survival of our planet in peace and justice without a global ethic. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Mario, for an extremely well-prepared and clear description of the task that we asked you to perform tonight. You may have, what was the word you used at the beginning to sort of say you're not really an expert? Did you were disavowed? Is that the word you used?
No, I didn't. I make no claims to be an expert.
No. No. But I think that you did justice extremely to the topic, and I think we found, at least I'm pretty sure we all found the points that you made very clearly expressed, and it's extremely timely in view. I think the crisis in the world at the moment just brought into even sharper focus the continuing great alienation between the various power blocks within the world, and this kind of looking back to glorious pasts that the people want to bring back again, make America great again, or make Russia great again, or the Soviet Empire great. I mean, I say, why not make the British Empire great again? Goodness me, that shows you how ridiculous that whole notion is. So I think that you've addressed something that is very timely for us tonight. And so I'd like to suggest that we break for a cuppa, and we continue to talk with each other. There's not a lot of us here tonight, so that discussion between us, I think, can continue. Just a word about next week. Next week, the session in this theory on ethics. It's up there. Going to be up there?
Click along.
Oh, I need a clicker. Thanks, Frank. Yeah, click along. There it is. The basis of creating a better world, and it's Michael Dowling, and he will be speaking from as a scientist, and I'm sure he's not out of step with some of the things you said about science tonight, but I think he will give us a very positive presentation. David McCurdy will be introducing him. He was a student of David when he was a geology student, and is now a Uniting Church minister at Blackwood. And again, that will be live streamed as tonight's has been. And so we want to say also thanks to all who are present, to those who've seen this on a live stream, and those of you who have yet to view this. But I think one final round of applause for Mario. Of course, we're always speaking about the other things that are going on. The third week, we have Martin Sampson coming back to us from Sydney, and he's going to be leading into a retreat that weekend from Friday night to Saturday. You'll still have time to vote, by the way, because we start late on Saturday morning. But I would like to commend this. It's going to be held here at Christchurch, and meals will be supplied for Friday night through to Saturday evening. It's not of great cost to attend. So if you've not considered this, please take one of these little brochures, and I'd like to commend week 3, Martin on the Thursday night, followed by the retreat that will be here on Friday night and Saturday. Is there anything else I should announce? I don't think so. Thanks again to you, Fergus, for being our able technician for tonight to make all this happen the way it has. Okay, thank you.